You were enlisted on the 7th of August, 1914. The morning you signed your name, the sun rose just like any other. The village was quiet, save for the church bells echoing their slow, ceremonial toll. You stood at the wooden gate of your father's forge, hands still blackened from the anvil, and listened to them. One beat for every second closer to war. One chime for every heartbeat that told you this was the right thing to do. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy drifting into these quiet worlds, where history forgets to be loud, and myth and memory walk hand in hand. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the brightness of your screen. Let your body loose. You've just crossed the first threshold. Let's slip gently into your journey. Together. The posters had gone up only days before. Your king and country need you. Lord Kitchener's finger pointed through the town square, through your bones, into the place where fear and duty argued in your chest. You weren't the only one. George from the grocer's, the Collins brothers from the farm, even lanky Rupert, who'd never fired a rifle, said he wouldn't be left behind. They told you it would be over by Christmas. A clean war. An adventure, almost. You packed your things in a borrowed satchel, spare shirt, your father's shaving kit, a photo of your mother, and a letter from your sister that smelled faintly of lavender. No one told you how much weight goodbye could carry when it was silent, when your mother pressed her hand to your chest without a word. Your father just nodded and gave you a pocket knife. He didn't say anything either, but the way he looked at you, like you'd aged 10 years in that one morning, stuck with you even as the train pulled away from Sussex Station. Your first stop, Aldershot. Rows of tents flapped in the late summer wind. Officers barked names and numbers like drill masters conducting a chaotic orchestra. You slept on rough canvas and learned to polish your boots until you could see your reflection in the toe. You were taught how to march in line, shoulder your Lee Enfield rifle, and shout, "Yes, sir," even when you didn't understand the question. The food was hot and tasteless. The nights were long and full of coughing, whispering, and the scratching of pens writing letters that might never be sent. There were jokes, too. Laughter, always a little too loud, like boys trying to remember how to be brave. You were one of them. You met Harold on the third day. He'd been a school teacher in Kent. Thin hands, gentle voice, but quick with a sharp observation and a slower smile. You stuck close to each other, like gravity pulling together two boys who didn't want to get lost. He called you Tommy, like the old songs. You started calling him Harry. After only a few weeks, they told you the 2nd Battalion Royal Sussex Regiment was shipping out to France. You wrote one last letter to your sister that night. You didn't mention the cold sweat that clung to your collar, or the boy in the next cot who wept after lights out. Instead, you wrote, "We'll be home before the frost, I'm sure. Save me a bit of apple pie." When the boat crossed the channel, the sea was as still as glass. No waves, just the quiet sound of boots on deck and the distant cries of gulls who didn't know war was coming. You clutched your rifle tighter than you meant to. France came into view through mist and morning sun, and with it, the first true shiver in your bones. You marched inland under blue skies, through quiet fields and towns where shutters closed as you passed. The French called out, "Bon courage," and offered bread and wine. Some of the men took it. Others just stared straight ahead, eyes already searching the horizon for something, anything, to tell them what to expect. By the time you reached the Belgian border, things had changed. You heard the distant rumble before you saw it. Artillery, low and constant like thunder far off at sea. Your first real orders came that afternoon. Advance toward Mons. The Germans were coming, and you were to stop them. The next day was your first day of battle. You didn't remember the order to fire. It just happened. You blinked, and suddenly the air was screaming. Bullets cracked like whips around you. Mud exploded near your boots. Harry was beside you one moment and gone the next, diving behind a tree, then reappearing like a rabbit from the hedgerow, shouting something you couldn't hear. Your heart didn't pound. It froze. You fired until your shoulder ached and your hands blistered. The air stank of oil and smoke and something metallic, sharp, like fear itself. When the retreat came, it was fast and merciless. Officers shouted orders that contradicted each other. You followed the boots in front of you, your legs moving without thought. You ran through ditches and hedgerows, across bridges blown to splinters behind you. You left behind one of your boots in a patch of sucking mud and didn't notice until nightfall. And somehow, through it all, you survived. You huddled in an abandoned barn with Harry that night. A cow had died in the corner. Rats were already at it. Neither of you spoke. You just passed a cigarette back and forth, hands trembling too much to light another. You didn't feel like a hero. The next morning, you looked around at the other survivors. Dirty faces, blank stares, boys with bandaged arms or missing fingers. Some prayed, others sang softly. You wrote a few words in your notebook and closed it again. It was only August. The war had just begun, but already something in you had changed. You had crossed the threshold, from Sussex to France, from forge to front line. And though the war would take much from you, it had already taken the boy you once were. You thought you understood what war would be. Then came the mud, the retreat, and the silence of the wounded. You were barely dry behind the ears when you reached the outskirts of Mons. Belgium looked like the countryside of home, open fields, the occasional grove, stone farmhouses with ivy crawling over red brick walls. But in the distance, just beyond the canal, lay something you could not name yet, only feel, like a cold breath on the back of your neck. The Germans were coming, and no matter how much your captain talked of a brave stand, you could hear it in his voice. They were coming in force. Your battalion dug in near the canal, makeshift trenches carved with shovels still slick from the journey. It wasn't proper defense. It wasn't even level ground. You and Harry took turns scooping muck and clearing stones while the officers argued over maps. You still remember how your hands blistered, how the soil smelled like wet iron. No one wanted to say it, but everyone was thinking the same thing. This was going to be bad. The Germans arrived like a storm. They advanced in waves, shoulder to shoulder in those early days, tight columns like something from a Napoleonic painting, until the machine guns shredded the front ranks and turned the rest into ghosts before they reached the canal. You watched as man after man fell, not with screams, but with a strange, awful stillness. It was quiet death. Your rifle jammed halfway through the first engagement. You didn't even notice until Harry shoved you and barked, "Fix it, Tommy!" You remember your fingers fumbling, your breath caught in your throat, your knees in wet clay. You fired again, blindly, not even seeing the target, and something inside you turned cold, not with fear, with detachment. A strange, automatic resolve. You became a soldier that day, but even resolve doesn't stop an army when it breaks. By nightfall, you were ordered to retreat. The Germans had found a weak flank, and the line was folding. One officer, just a boy himself, shouted, "Fall back!" and was shot mid-sentence. You didn't look back. You couldn't. The air was thick with smoke, and the sky had turned an orange-gray, like a dying ember. You moved through shattered fields, past twisted fences and plowed crops. Along the road, you passed civilians, some fleeing, others just watching in numb silence. An old woman pressed a crust of bread into your hand. A little girl stared at your muddy boots like they were from another world. You marched for days. No hot meals, no change of clothes, just dry rations, black tea, and blisters so raw they bled through your socks. It was during that retreat you first saw what artillery could truly do. Near Le Cateau, a shell landed in the trees just ahead of your position. The sound didn't come all at once. It built, like thunder rolling downhill, then light, then splinters, then screams. You dropped flat in the mud, too stunned to breathe. When you lifted your head, the trees were no longer trees, just broken poles, stripped bare. A horse lay crushed beneath a wagon. A man's body, what was left of it, clung to a torn fence. Later, when the shelling paused, you helped carry the wounded. One of them, a boy no older than 16, grabbed your arm and whispered, "Tell my mom I fought." He died before you could ask his name. At night, you wrote another letter home, this time to your mother. You didn't mention the boy or the blood. You simply wrote, "We're tired, but holding on. Give Daisy a pat from me." You signed it the same way you always did. Your loving son. The rain came in September, slow at first, then relentless. You remember the day you first stood ankle-deep in trench water. Your socks were already soaked. You'd stopped feeling your toes an hour earlier. The trench had no proper drainage, just sandbags and prayers. Men were coughing now, wet coughs, deep and rattling. Lice moved like shadows across the back of your neck. Harry caught trench fever and was sent to a field hospital for 3 weeks. You felt like your right arm had been torn off. In his place came Corporal Wainwright, stern, dry-voiced, and 10 years older than the rest of you. He had seen India, the Boer War, and now this. "War's never noble," he said once, lighting a pipe. "Just necessary, or so they tell us." You slept sitting up most nights, your helmet balanced on your knees. One morning, you woke to find a dead rat on your blanket, stiff with cold. You tossed it without a word. Your dreams began to change. They weren't nightmares, not the usual kind. Instead, they were eerily normal. Sitting in your father's forge, brushing mud off your boots, or feeding the chickens behind the house. And always, when you woke, for a moment you believed you were home, until the stink of the trench and the groaning of the wounded reminded you where you were. One afternoon, during a lull in fighting, you saw a German scout across no man's land. He was standing by a tree, watching you, not moving, not raising a rifle, just watching. You stared back. Neither of you spoke or fired. After a minute, he simply turned and vanished into the fog. That night, you wrote in your notebook, "We look more alike than they said." By the end of September, you'd survived Mons, Le Cateau, and the Great Retreat. You had blisters across your heels. Your coat was no longer brown, but gray with grime. Your soul felt stretched thinner than your soul's. Yet you were still here, alive, not untouched, never that, but alive. In just a few short weeks, you had seen what men could do to each other, and what men could endure. But the worst was still ahead, and winter was coming. It is September 1914. You were asleep on your feet when the orders came. After weeks of marching, fighting, and fleeing, you and what remained of your battalion found yourselves under a gray sky in northern France, skinny from hunger, heavy with exhaustion. You were too tired to wonder why the retreat had stopped, why you hadn't been ordered to fall back again. But when the captain stood on an overturned crate and barked, "We move north. This time, we meet them head on," something strange stirred in your chest. Not fear, not hope either, just readiness, a kind of stillness, like the silence before thunder. You had reached the River Marne. The Germans were advancing fast, too fast. Paris itself was under threat, and every man in your regiment knew what was at stake. There were rumors the French were using taxis to rush soldiers to the front. You couldn't believe that. Then you saw them, black motor cars, dozens of them, crawling across the country roads, filled with men in blue coats and red trousers. It would have been funny if it weren't so desperate. The orders were simple: push forward, regain ground, hold the line. You crossed the Marne under cover of fog. The water was low, but fast. You and Harry waded chest deep, rifles raised above your heads, shivering in silence. On the far side, the trees were splintered. The fields churned to ruin. Shell craters had turned pasture into moonscape. Somewhere in the haze, a piano played. Just a few notes. Someone must have found it in a ruined house. The sound felt like memory. Your boots squelched as you climbed the opposite bank. Then came the gunfire. It started in bursts, crackles and pops echoing across the fields, then rose into a roar. You dropped behind a half-toppled stone wall, mud clinging to your coat like oil. The French were ahead of you, charging with bayonets and cries of "En avant!" You followed. You had to. Not out of bravery, but out of something simpler. Momentum. You didn't remember raising your rifle, but you remembered the shot that found its mark. He was no older than you, maybe younger. A German boy, blue eyes wide, arms flailing as he fell backward like a puppet with cut strings. You stood frozen. Then someone screamed your name, and you ran again, deeper into the smoke. You took a village that day, or what was left of one. Its name was Crowy, or Cray, or maybe Creppy. You never really found out. The buildings were hollow shells. A dog barked behind a smashed door. You and Harry holed up in what used to be a bakery, now filled with flour-dusted rubble and shattered crockery. You found a bag of raisins in a tin and shared it without speaking. That night, you slept on broken tiles beside an open window, and dreamed of your sister making jam. The next day brought victory. The Germans had pulled back. An orderly retreat, your captain said, but a retreat all the same. The Marne had been held. Paris was safe. But no cheers rose from your camp. No songs, no toasts. Just a quiet kind of relief. As if you'd been holding your breath for weeks and finally could exhale. You wrote a letter home. We've turned them back. We're holding fast now. I think I'm getting used to this. You weren't. A week later, you were digging again. Only this time, you weren't just carving a ditch. You were building a world. The trench began as a shallow cut in the earth, meant to protect you from snipers and shrapnel. But as days turned to weeks, it deepened. Sandbags piled up like castle walls. Duckboards were laid to keep the water down. Latrines were dug. Tins of bully beef were stacked. And so, the war stopped moving. The race to the sea, they called it in the papers. A mad scramble northward as both sides dug, stretched, and tried to outflank each other. But there was no winner, just a scar across the land from the Alps to the English Channel. You became part of that scar. The days blurred. You rose before dawn to stand to, watching the pale sky from a fire step as rats scurried past your boots. You shaved when you could, using water from your canteen and a broken mirror someone had tied to a bayonet. You wrote letters in the quiet moments, sometimes with nothing to say. Harry told jokes, bad ones, puns about sausages and trench lice. You laughed too hard at them, and he knew why. Once, you found a bird's nest in the wall of the trench. 3 tiny eggs, still warm. No one touched them. You just stood in a line and stared like children at a magic trick. Rain became a companion. It soaked your socks and drowned your cigarettes. It turned the floor of the trench into a soup of clay and filth. Once, during a downpour, the trench wall gave way, and 2 men were buried in seconds. You helped dig them out, one alive, one not. They buried the dead one near a willow tree, barely 5 yards from the trench. A chaplain said words none of you heard. As September faded into October, the war settled into rhythm. At night, you heard the Germans singing, sometimes hymns, sometimes lullabies. One evening, someone on your side played a harmonica. The tune floated over no man's land, caught in the mist. The Germans applauded. That moment stayed with you longer than the battles did. And so you waited, for orders, for letters, for the war to start again. You had crossed rivers, watched friends die, killed men you'd never met, and now, finally, you were no longer moving. The front had frozen. The earth had swallowed you whole. And somewhere, far from the Marne, autumn leaves were falling in Sussex. But you would not see them this year, not for many years to come. You learned to live beneath the earth, between the bullets and the frost. The frost came slowly. One morning, the edges of the sandbags glistened white. By the next, your breath hung in the air like smoke. And just like that, the Great War became a waiting game played in frozen silence. You were still on the Western Front, but now you weren't moving. No more charging or chasing, just standing still, in mud. The trench was your world, 4 feet wide, 6 feet deep, a narrow corridor of filth that curved like a wounded snake through the fields of France. The walls sagged with moisture. The floor clung to your boots with every step, like it wanted to pull you under. When it rained, and it often did, the water rose to your calves and stayed there. You learned to sleep sitting up, leaning against the side of the trench with your helmet tilted forward like a curtain. Rats scurried across your chest as you slept. You learned not to flinch. Lice itched your scalp until your skin bled. You learned not to scratch. You learned, above all, how to endure. Stand to at dawn. Every man awake, rifles loaded, eyes searching the fog. Then breakfast, hardtack biscuits, cold tea, sometimes a tin of jam if luck was on your side. If you weren't on sentry duty, you wrote letters, mended socks, dried your feet by candle flame, cleaned your rifle again and again, even though it was already spotless. You needed something to do with your hands. You started naming the rats. There was a fat one with a split tail. Harry called him General Mud. He ruled the corner of your trench like a mascot. You gave up trying to scare him off. He was probably there before you were, and he'd likely outlast you too. Harry was back from hospital. He limped now and coughed often, but he was still sharp-eyed and quick-witted. You were grateful for him. Sometimes, in the dead hours between midnight and stand to, you whispered stories from home, about the girl at the bakery, or the old dog who used to follow you to school. Harry told you about his classroom, how the boys used to fall asleep during Latin. One night, he admitted, "I don't remember their names anymore." You didn't know what to say. So you just sat there, shoulder to shoulder, sharing warmth in a trench that felt colder than the moon. Mail arrived once a week, maybe. You stopped hoping for it. When it came, it felt like sunlight in a dark tunnel. One letter from your sister read, "They say the war is worse than we're told. Are you eating enough? Are you warm?" You laughed at that, quietly. Warm? The word felt like a dream. You tried to reply, but didn't know how to explain the way the earth swallowed sound. How a man could die 3 feet from you and no one would know until morning. How sometimes, in the night, the world went quiet, not with peace, but with waiting. The trench never slept, even when you did. Shellfire came irregularly, a sudden roar, a shock wave through the earth. You could feel it in your teeth before you heard it. The walls would shake, dust would rain down, and men would brace for the worst. Sometimes the shells landed far off. Sometimes they didn't. You lost Davies that way. He was lighting a cigarette, sitting just beside you. Then a whistling sound, a flash, and nothing. When the dust cleared, he was gone. Just gone. The cigarette lay burning in the dirt, untouched. You stared at it for a long time. They sent a chaplain the next day. He read the 23rd Psalm over a mass grave. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." You said nothing, but in your heart you thought, "I live in that valley now." And still, the war did not end. Weeks passed, then months. The trench deepened. Timber supports were added to keep the walls from collapsing. A small dugout was carved beneath the floor, a place to hide from the worst of the shelling. You called it the Snug. It was anything but. Corporal Wainwright lost his foot to frostbite. The medics came for him with a stretcher, and he went quietly. You heard he asked to keep his boot. You don't know if they let him. At night, you stared up at the sky. It was always so clean. Stars like pinholes in velvet. No smoke up there. No rats. Just peace. You wondered if your mother was looking at the same sky. Maybe she was. Maybe she whispered your name into the darkness, hoping it would reach you. Then came something strange, something beautiful. It was December, Christmas Eve. The shooting had slowed in the days leading up. A ceasefire had been rumored. No one believed it. But that night, you heard singing from across no man's land, in German. Stille Nacht, heilige Nacht. You and Harry stood on the fire step, listening. One by one, other heads rose from the trench. You didn't speak. You just listened. Then, from your own side, a Welshman began to sing back. Silent night, holy night. The two songs drifted into one, a harmony caught in the frozen air between enemy lines. The next morning, Christmas Day, you saw something you never thought you would. A German soldier stepped over the top, unarmed, hands raised, then another, and another. You watched in disbelief as they walked across no man's land. One carried a small tree with candles on it. Another had sausages tied to a stick like a gift. Then someone from your trench climbed out. Then Harry. Then you. You met in the middle. No guns, no shouting, just handshakes, nods, a few words. Some men traded cigarettes, others swapped buttons or chocolate. A few played football with a battered ball and makeshift goals. You remember the way a German lad your age smiled as he kicked the ball, then tripped over a shell crater and laughed like a schoolboy. You laughed too. For a moment, you weren't enemies. You were just men. That night, you returned to your trench and sat beside Harry. The silence felt different, softer somehow. He passed you a bit of sausage. You shared your last piece of bread. Neither of you spoke of war, or death, or home, just the stars. You had survived the cold, the rats, the lice, and the grief. And for one miraculous night, you had remembered what it felt like to be human again. But peace would not last. Not yet. The war still waited. And so did the spring. Now it's December 1914. When silence fell between enemies, and you remembered you were still alive. You never expected Christmas. Not really. Not in a trench, not with frozen toes and mold on your bread and shells buried in your sleep. But somehow, as December deepened and the nights grew quieter, something changed. The fighting didn't stop, but it slowed. The sounds of war faded just enough for you to hear the wind. And in that space, something ancient crept in. Hope. It began with music. You'd just finished cleaning your rifle, more out of habit than necessity, when you heard it. A low hum. Soft at first, then clearer. Not English. German. A tune you half knew. A melody that pressed gently on something buried in your chest. Stille Nacht, heilige Nacht. You climbed the fire step slowly, peering over the top. The sky was silvered with frost. The moon, full and low, cast long shadows across no man's land. There were no flares, no gunshots, just voices. Then another voice joined in, from your side. Jenkins, the lad from Wales, his tenor warm as ever. Silent night, holy night. The two languages met in the still air, and for the first time since Mons, you felt your lungs truly fill. Harry stood beside you, mouth slightly open. "Bloody hell," he murmured. "They're caroling." By morning, the world had changed. You were making tea over a candle stub when a runner stumbled into the trench with wide eyes and breathless news. "The Germans are coming across, without weapons." There was a pause, a long one, then scrambling, boots thudding, rifles lifted halfway, not aiming, not lowering either. You rose with the others, heart thrumming like a drum. You peeked over the sandbags. They really were coming. Slowly, hands raised high, overcoats buttoned tight, faces pale but not frightened. One of them held up a small fir tree wrapped in silver paper. Another carried a crate labeled sausages. A few had their helmets decorated with holly and ribbon. One of them laughed nervously and said something in English. "No shoot. We friends today, yes? You didn't know who moved first." Maybe it was Harry. Maybe it was you. But someone climbed out. Then another. Then, without any real decision, without orders, without plans, you found yourself walking through no man's land. The snow crunched underfoot. Beneath it, somewhere, were the dead, frozen, buried by time and frost. You tried not to look down. A German soldier, no older than you, held out a chocolate bar. You took it. In return, you gave him your last 2 cigarettes. He grinned like a schoolboy and showed you a photograph of a woman and child. "Meine Frau," he said softly. "Lena und meine kleine Anna." You nodded, showing him a folded letter from your sister. He didn't need to read it to understand. All around you, the same thing happened again and again. Hands reached across the void, smiles, nods, even laughter. It felt like waking up. Someone brought out a football, an old one, patched with string and mud, but still round enough to roll. You joined the game. No rules, just men kicking and chasing and slipping in the snow like boys on a village green. You laughed when Harry fell face first into a drift. The German beside him helped him up, grinning through a bloodied lip. They even tried to sing again. This time, "O Tannenbaum," and then, "God rest ye merry, gentlemen." Neither side knew the full verses, but no one cared. The song itself was enough. You found yourself sitting with 4 strangers, 2 from each side, sharing bits of bread, a sip of rum, and the kind of silence that speaks louder than words. One German had played violin before the war. Another had worked in a pub in London. You wondered if you'd ever served him, years ago. As night returned, the frost deepened. The officers grew nervous. Orders began filtering down, soft at first, then sharper. "Return to trenches. Cease fraternization." This is not a sanctioned truce. But no one moved right away. You stood there a moment longer, staring at the man across from you. You didn't know his name. You never would. But you nodded, and he nodded back. That, you thought, might be the most important thing I do in this war. You returned to the trench. So did they. No one fired that night. You sat with Harry, warming your hands over a candle, the sound of German carols still echoing faintly across the field. He looked at you and said, "Mad, isn't it?" One day we're trying to kill each other. Next day, we're swapping jam. You smiled. Maybe that's what makes us human. Then you wrote a letter to your sister, one that would never quite do the moment justice. It snowed today. I played football with a man from Hamburg. We both laughed. I don't know what the world's become, but for a few hours, it was something better. The war would return. The machine guns, the gas, the orders, the blood. But now you knew something they couldn't take from you. That behind the uniform, the enemy had a face. In a world that had torn itself apart, you saw a glimpse of what it could be, if only for a night. Not soldiers, not enemies, just sons, brothers, friends. And in that quiet pause, you remembered that even war has cracks, where peace can grow. It's April 22nd, 1915. You saw the horizon turn yellow, and the air itself became a weapon. Spring should have brought relief. That's what you told yourself when the frost melted and the mud began to harden. Your trench near Ypres had held through a long gray winter. Rain still fell, but the air carried a faint scent of new grass, and in the evenings, birds returned, thin songs drifting above the shattered trees. The war, of course, didn't stop for seasons, but for a little while, it slowed. You'd fallen into rhythm, stand to, ration tins, letters, rifle maintenance. The trenches became cities in the earth, wood-lined walls, duck boards, dugouts, even makeshift chapels made from sandbags and stolen wood. You had stopped hoping for anything big. Victory, peace. Even home felt like something distant and mythic. You just hoped to survive the next week. It happened on a Thursday, the 22nd of April. You remember the sky was pale blue, streaked with feathery clouds. You'd just finished checking the periscope when Harry nudged you, nodding toward the German lines. "Something's moving," he whispered. You looked. The horizon was wrong. At first, it looked like mist, rolling low across no man's land. But mist doesn't move like that. It doesn't curl upward or pulse like it's alive. Then you saw the color, sickly yellow, pale green, like rotting hay. And you felt it in your lungs before it reached you. A sting, a burn, then a panic, fast and sharp as lightning. "Gas! Gas!" The cry went up, loud and raw, repeated down the line in voices cracking from terror. You fumbled for your respirator, but back then it wasn't much. A strip of flannel soaked in urine, tied across your face like a poor man's bandage. You pressed it tight and prayed it would hold. The cloud hit you like a slap. It stung your eyes. You couldn't see. You couldn't breathe. Every gasp was fire. Your throat closed, your chest seized, and for a moment, you thought you were drowning on dry land. Men screamed, coughed, clawed at their faces. Some climbed out of the trench, running blindly. Some didn't move at all. One of the Canadians dropped beside you, his mouth foaming, eyes wide and glassy. You'd never learned his name. He was dead before you could ask. Harry pulled you into a side trench, half collapsed, half mud, and covered your head with a blanket. You both crouched there, panting, retching, listening to the groans of men dying without wounds. The world smelled of chlorine and sweat and fear. And then, silence. The gas passed. You emerged slowly, blinking, coughing, your lungs raw. The trench was chaos. Bodies slumped over the fire step. Rats picked their way through kits and fallen helmets. A man rocked back and forth, clutching his throat, eyes bloodshot and wild. They called it poison gas. You called it the devil in the wind. That night, no one slept. You sat with Harry in the dugout, a candle flickering between you, the smoke from it making your nose twitch. He held a pencil in one hand and a trembling sheet of paper in the other. "What do I write home after this?" he asked. You didn't know. So you said, "Tell them you're still breathing. That's something." He gave a dry laugh. Then he put down the pencil. You tried to eat, but your throat still burned. Every swallow felt like swallowing needles. The others were the same. No one complained. There wasn't the strength for it. In the days that followed, they brought in reinforcements. Scots, fresh-faced, unaware. You tried to warn them. If you see mist where there shouldn't be mist, run. One lad nodded, then asked, "Run where exactly?" You had no answer. Command sent better masks. Bulky rubber things with thick glass and filters that looked like tin cans. They worked, mostly. But by then, gas had become part of your life. You slept with the mask around your neck. You trained yourself to wake at the first hint of sweetness in the air. Because gas, you learned, sometimes smelled like flowers, like apples, like almonds. You learned to fear smells. There was a saying that spread through the trench after Ypres. You can't fight what you can't see. You saw the truth in it every time a man dropped without warning, clutching his face, his voice gone to a dry wheeze. One night, you found a crow perched on the edge of the trench, unmoving, dead, its feathers tinted yellow. Even the birds weren't safe. But through it all, you stayed. Because that's what you did. You patched the walls. You cleaned your rifle. You checked your mask straps twice instead of once. You stopped writing about the gas in your letters. What was there to say? Instead, you wrote, "The war has changed." We are digging deeper now. I think of home often. You didn't say how many of your friends now breathed like old men, or how many stared blankly at their food without eating. You didn't describe the sound men made when their lungs filled with fluid. It was a wet, soft gurgle. You would carry that sound for the rest of your life. You also didn't write that part of you had gone quiet, not dead, just quiet, like a room you locked and left behind. You had faced a new kind of enemy, not made of muscle or steel, but of air and terror. And though your body lived, something in you was changed. The ground was still solid, but the sky was no longer safe. It's summer 1915. For one night, there was no side, only mud, memory, and the living shadows of the dead. You were never supposed to be there alone. No man's land was not a place for lingering. It was a corridor of ghosts, watched from both sides, mined beneath the earth, choked with barbed wire and bone. You crossed it only when ordered. You stayed low. You prayed no one sneezed, no boots slipped, no flares rose. But that night, something went wrong. You'd volunteered for the patrol. 4 men. Quiet movement. Crawl out, check wire integrity, find the broken segment in the northeast flank. Return before moonrise. You carried only a revolver and a coil of wire. Harry was one of them. You remember the way he adjusted his helmet just before going over the top. It was a habit, almost like a salute. You slipped out under cover of darkness, into the wasteland between 2 worlds. The mud sucked at your knees. Shell holes yawned wide like open mouths. The air was still. The only sound was your breath behind your mask and the faint ticking of your watch in your chest pocket. You moved like shadows, slow, low, hands feeling your way along the earth. Then came the flare. It bloomed in the sky, white hot, hissing, turning night into a frozen nightmare. For a moment, you saw everything. Wire fences tangled like thorns, craters filled with rain. 6 bodies, twisted and slack, caught in the act of dying. And then, gunfire. Ripping, shattering noise. Muzzle flashes stuttered in the dark. You dove, face first, into mud that filled your ears and throat. Screams followed, sharp and too close. You crawled toward the sound of Harry's voice, but found only more blackness. A shell landed behind you, closer than any before. It didn't scream. It popped, and everything went quiet. When you woke, the sky was dark again. No stars, no moon. You couldn't hear anything except the faint hum of your ears and your own breath. 1 boot was gone. Your coat was torn open across the ribs. Your helmet lay meters away. You reached for it, then paused. You weren't in the trench. You were alone, in no man's land. Your first instinct was to call out. You opened your mouth. But the silence was sacred, thin and trembling. Any sound might bring another flare, another volley. You stayed low and waited. Time passed. You don't know how long. The dark played tricks on your mind. You began to see shapes in the mud. Faces, maybe. Fingers. A torn boot that looked too familiar. Something in the distance shifted, then froze again. You tried to crawl back, but every direction looked the same. Every foot forward could be toward safety, or toward the German line. You turned once and saw the shape of a soldier, lying face up in the open. Eyes open, mouth slightly parted. He wore no helmet. His scalp had been taken by fire or shrapnel. You almost spoke to him. He looked like he was listening. You pressed on. Your ribs ached. Your arm was numb. The wire you'd been carrying was gone. Your revolver, too. All you had was your pocket knife, your breath, and a scrap of a song your sister used to hum. Then you heard footsteps. Soft, careful, not boots, cloth on mud. You froze. A figure moved nearby, bent, cautious. You gripped your knife, held your breath. The figure stopped, turned. You locked eyes. It was a German, not a silhouette, not a shadow. A man, young. His rifle slung over his back, hands raised slightly, not in surrender, but in calm. You both stared at each other for what felt like an hour. He could have shouted. So could you. He could have killed you. You could have tried the same. But neither of you moved. He made a small gesture, 2 fingers to his lips, then a downward motion. Be quiet. Stay low. You nodded. Then he pointed west, toward your lines, then east, toward his, then up at the sky, then tapped his wrist. He was saying, "Wait." You understood. He sat down in the mud, not far off, not close enough to touch, but close enough to hear if you whispered. And so you waited together. 2 soldiers, 2 boys, each with a war on the other side of the wire, sitting in a forgotten hole in the earth beneath a sky that had seen too much. At one point, he took something from his coat, a crust of bread. He tore it in half, tossed a piece your way. You caught it. You didn't eat it. You just held it. Somewhere in the distance, a flare lifted, far off. A ripple of fire, gunshots, nothing near. Still, you waited. When dawn came, pale and thin as paper, he stood, nodded once, then turned. He didn't speak. You never learned his name. You don't know if he made it out. But you remember the shape of his face. You remember that he was kind. You found your trench again after sunrise. A scout spotted you crawling toward the wire. You were pulled in, lifted, examined. A medic wrapped your ribs and gave you water. You answered no questions. Harry was alive. Shaken, scraped, but breathing. He'd thought you dead. You didn't speak about what had happened. Not to him, not to anyone. But that night, when the flares rose again, you thought of the man in the dark, the one who didn't shoot, who shared his bread, who pointed you back to your own war. You had wandered into the mouth of death and returned. And in the heart of the most godless place, you had met not a devil, but a mirror. Somewhere between the wire and the world, you remembered again. This war was made by men, and it could be ended by them too. It's July 1916. You walked into the fire with 50,000 others. You walked out alone. You woke up on the 1st of July, 1916, to the sound of silence, not peace, something worse, an unnatural quiet that coated everything like dust before a storm. You'd been moved south weeks before, from Ypres to the Somme. The chalky soil was different here, dry, pale, almost brittle. They said this would be the big push, the one to end the war. Break through the German line, they told you. Smash their defenses. Walk into victory. You'd heard that before. But this time, they meant it. They'd spent 7 days bombarding the German trenches, over 1 million shells. The sky never dimmed. It flickered like a faulty lantern, constant flashes, constant thunder. You watched the horizon shake and thought, nothing could live through that. You were wrong. The whistle blew at 7:30 a.m. You climbed the ladder, boots thudding on timber. You rose into daylight, into the open, into death. It was the first time in months you'd stood fully upright outside the trench. You expected to feel the sun. Instead, you felt the fear, thick and low in your belly, like a second heartbeat. And then, you walked, side by side with hundreds, no, thousands of others, shoulder to shoulder across the open field, rifles held low, boots sinking into chalk-white earth. And then the machine guns opened. They hadn't been destroyed. You heard it before you saw it. The sound, like canvas tearing, over and over and over again. Men fell, dropped, vanished, without warning, without screams. To your left, a lad you'd never spoken to collapsed mid-step. To your right, an officer turned to shout an order and was cut in half. You dropped too. Not from a bullet, just instinct. You hit the dirt, scrambled forward, crawled through blood and bone and the stink of death. You found a shell hole and rolled in. Harry was beside you, breathing fast. His eyes wide, his mouth dry. He mouthed something, but the gunfire drowned it out. You waited, for minutes, maybe hours. When you moved again, it wasn't with orders. It was just motion. Survival. You crawled through mud and torn canvas, through barbed wire not fully cleared. Your hands bled from grabbing it. Your knees shredded from stone and bone alike. At one point, you passed a boy still alive, pinned beneath a plank. His leg was gone. He whispered, "Don't leave me." You promised you wouldn't. But you did. You had to. Later, you would remember his face, not his name, just his eyes, blue, unblinking. You reached the lip of a German trench, not empty, still defended. You jumped in with a scream you didn't recognize as your own. It was like slipping into a grave. The fighting was hand to hand, faces smeared with dirt, knives in fists, bayonets too long for close quarters. A man lunged at you with a shovel. You fired point blank. You didn't check if he lived. The trench stank of blood and urine. The walls were slick. You were ankle deep in water, half blind, deafened. You held your rifle like a club. And then, it stopped. Not all at once, but gradually. The firing slowed. The shouting died. Only groans remained. Moans. That strange, soft weeping of the wounded who've lost too much blood to scream. You sat in the mud. You counted to 10. Then again, and again. Your fingers trembled too much to open your pack. You looked at Harry. His helmet was gone. His face pale. But he was alive. For now. The first day of the Somme had claimed nearly 60,000 British casualties. It would not be the last. The battle dragged on for 5 more months. You stopped marking time by days. You used smells instead. The stink of mustard gas in August, the rot of horses in September, the slow, sweet decay of October rain. You took a bullet in the shoulder on the 14th of August. Not serious. You patched it yourself with shaking hands and cursed your luck. Harry caught a shell fragment in his thigh. He limped afterward, but he still made jokes. By October, the trenches had become pits of despair. Men wept openly. Officers stared at maps with empty eyes. You saw a man shoot his own foot, just to go home. By then, you understood. You were no longer fighting for ground. You were fighting because someone, somewhere, refused to say enough. The earth was full of the dead. The trees were bare. The sky was colorless. And you were still alive, still breathing, still writing letters you didn't know would reach anyone. In one, you wrote, "The earth here eats men. It remembers their names better than we do." On the final day of the battle, they told you you'd advanced 6 miles in 5 months. 6 miles. for 500,000 dead. You didn't celebrate. You didn't feel victorious. You just packed your rifle, cleaned your boots, and waited for the next order. At the Somme, you saw war not as glory, but as ritual, a terrible repetition of fire and flesh, where men became smoke. You stepped into hell not to win, but to survive. And you came back changed. 1916, 1917. In a world made of mud and noise, her letters arrived like sunlight. You met her on paper. The first letter came in September 1916, while your arm was still in a sling from the wound at the Somme. You were resting in a recovery camp, if you could call it that, a tent pitched on high ground behind the front, surrounded by makeshift wards, the moaning of the wounded, and the tired shuffle of nurses. You weren't expecting post. But there it was, a white envelope, neat handwriting, ink dark and even. You didn't recognize the name, Eleanor Hughes, but the letter was addressed to you, plain as day. And it began, "Dear soldier, I don't know your name, but I know you're out there." She was a volunteer from a church group in Norwich. They'd begun writing to men at the front, strangers, pen pals, glimpses of the world beyond the wire. You read her letter 3 times before replying. You told her your name was Thomas, that you were from Sussex, that your mother baked jam pies every Sunday, that your best friend Harry was a school teacher and had a limp now, but still told jokes. You didn't tell her about the boy at the Somme who died singing to himself, or the one who'd gone mad and charged into the dark with no weapon at all. You left those parts out. You ended the letter simply, "Thank you. It's been a long time since someone wrote just to be kind." Her next reply came 2 weeks later. She thanked you for the jam pie story, said she hadn't eaten a decent dessert in months, as sugar was being rationed. She asked if the stars looked the same from where you were. She hoped they did. And so began a rhythm, different from the rhythm of shells or drills. A new pulse. A quiet, steady beat beneath the noise. She asked nothing of you, except stories. And so, you gave them. You told her about the rat you'd named Percy, who stole biscuits from your coat pocket every night. About the time Harry found a dog near the trench and tried to teach it to salute. About the time you climbed a tree in a lull between battles, just to see above the smoke. She sent you pressed flowers once, daisies from her garden. You held them for hours, fingers trembling. You didn't know why they moved you so deeply until later. It was the first living thing you'd touched in months that didn't flinch. In return, you sent her a poem. Nothing fancy. Just a few lines you scribbled in the margin of a ration wrapper. In fields of ash and wire and stone, your words arrive like sun on bone. A stranger's hand, I'll never hold. And yet, somehow, you make me whole. You didn't know if she'd like it. She sent a scarf in return, hand-stitched, deep green, with tiny yellow threads. It smelled faintly of lavender and soap. You wore it under your coat, close to your skin. Even Harry noticed. "Got yourself a lady, Tommy?" You shrugged. "Maybe." He smiled. "Keep writing. You look like you've got color again." Winter came early that year. The snow turned the trenches into ice boxes. Rations froze solid in their tins. But you were different. Lighter, warmer. Not in body, but in mind. Because now, there was someone out there, beyond the smoke and newsprint and missing lists, someone who thought of you not as a soldier, not as a number, but as Thomas. One day, she wrote, I don't know what your eyes look like, but I think they've seen more than most men twice your age. I hope they still carry kindness. You cried when you read it. Not loudly, just a slow leak. Quiet, controlled. You didn't show Harry, but he saw anyway. The next week, you asked her, what would we talk about if there wasn't a war between us? She answered, books, music, cats, everything ordinary. That's what I miss most, the ordinary things. In a trench that smelled of smoke and blood, you dreamed of ordinary things, of standing in a quiet garden, of laughing over tea, of holding her letter with clean hands. You'd never seen her face, but you started to imagine one. Not perfect, just warm. And with each letter, she became more real than the war around you. Sometimes, you'd read her words out loud to yourself when the shells started falling, like armor, like prayer. You wondered if you'd ever meet her, walk with her down a foggy street, watch her eyes light up as you quoted one of her own lines back to her. You never dared to say it out loud, but in your bones, you hoped. You held her letters longer than orders, folded them more carefully than maps. You had seen men die with nothing. You would not die without love, even if it came from afar. In the middle of a world built to tear men down, a voice found its way to you, soft, gentle, human. You were more than a soldier now. You were a man someone waited for, and that changed everything. It's early 1917. You began to wonder if the war could break more than just bodies. The new year came with a thud, not a celebration. No bells, no fireworks. Just another cold dawn over a cratered field. You scratched another mark into the inside of your helmet. 1917, the third winter. The frost had returned, but you no longer felt it like before. Your body had grown numb to it, same way your ears stopped reacting to distant shell fire, like background noise, like breathing. But something was different now. Not in the mud, not in the smoke, in the men. The jokes had grown quieter, the letters fewer. You noticed how long it took for anyone to look up when the officer passed. You saw how some men barely cleaned their rifles anymore, unless they were ordered to. You noticed the silence most of all, and the questions. They started small, whispered, like someone talking in their sleep. Why are we still here? Didn't they say it would be over by last Christmas? We took that trench 3 months ago, then gave it back a week later. What was the point? You didn't answer, because you had no answer. Even Harry had changed. The limp had worsened. His cough, too, and his eyes, still bright, still kind, now often stared too long at the horizon, as if waiting for it to tell him something. One morning, after breakfast rations, he asked, "Do you think the generals ever walk through this place?" You shrugged. Probably not. He nodded, then looked down at the bread in his hands. I'd like to meet one, just to ask what we're supposed to be learning here. In March, you heard about the French. A murmur passed down the line like wind through grass. They've refused to fight. Mutiny. The word hung heavy. It didn't come with full details, not at first, just fragments. entire battalions refusing orders, soldiers turning their rifles away from the enemy, not toward their officers, but toward the sky, toward the futility. They weren't running. They weren't cowards. They were simply done. At first, you didn't believe it. Then came confirmation. Official. From the chaplain, no less. He tried to reassure you, said the British line would hold firm, that your side remained disciplined, that your cause was still just. But in your heart, something shifted, because you understood. And more than that, you envied them, not for their defiance, but for the honesty. You'd been here too long. You'd watched too many men go under the earth without changing a single map. You'd followed orders that looped in circles, retaking the same ridge 3 times, only to be told to leave it again. One afternoon, during a lull, you climbed a hill behind your sector, against orders, and looked out over the battlefield. From that height, the war looked still. No movement. Just scars on the land. Empty, gray. And for the first time, you felt truly tired. Not sleepy, not exhausted. Worn. From the inside out. That night, you wrote to Eleanor, "I know this war must be won, but sometimes it feels like it's eating its own tail, spinning and bleeding without end." She replied, weeks later, "You are not alone in that feeling, Thomas, and you're not broken for feeling it. Even the strongest can question. It doesn't make you weak. It makes you human." You read that line over and over, because by then, even your dreams had grown quiet. No longer wild flashes or thunder or loss, just stillness, like a room after a funeral. They increased the drills that month. Harder marches, more inspections. They said it was to keep morale up. But you knew. They feared it. The spread of doubt. The possibility that even British soldiers might stop saying, "Yes, sir." Still, you stood to every morning, cleaned your boots, loaded your rifle, held your post, not because you believed every word anymore, but because Harry still needed you, because someone had to keep writing to Eleanor, because even if the war had lost its voice, yours hadn't. One day, a new officer arrived. Young, too young, his uniform clean, his gloves soft. He gave a speech, reading from a folded paper. It was about courage, sacrifice, the glory of empire. When he finished, you looked around. No one clapped. No one saluted. They just went back to fixing bayonets, lighting cigarettes, scraping lice from collars. The officer said nothing, just stared for a while, and then, perhaps wisely, walked away. You had not rebelled. You had not run. But something inside you had shifted, like a door closing gently. Not broken, but changed. You now knew. The war wasn't only fought with bullets. It was fought with belief. And belief, too, could bleed. Passchendaele, July 1917. You watched men sink while standing still. You fought not just the enemy, but the earth itself. The mud at Passchendaele didn't feel like mud. It felt like memory turned to rot. You arrived in July, just as the rain began. At first, it seemed typical. Wet, yes, but you'd seen worse. You were used to the stink of damp wool, the drip of water from dugout ceilings, the cold crawling up from your boots. But then the days blurred. The sky didn't change. The sun vanished for weeks. And the rain, it simply never stopped. By August, the trench wasn't a trench. It was a canal, a brown, stinking river that swallowed boots, blankets, and sometimes entire men. You saw it with your own eyes. Private Latham, a quiet lad from Yorkshire, stepped off the duckboard to avoid a broken crate. One foot sunk, then the other. You reached for him. He panicked, struggled. The mud pulled harder. He went down to his knees, then waist, then chest. By the time you got a rope, he was gone. Just bubbles and silence. You didn't sleep that night. Neither did Harry. He sat in the dugout, staring at nothing, his coat soaked through. After a while, he said, "If hell has a season, it's this one." The shell fire returned soon after. You couldn't hear it at first. The rain drowned everything. But then it came, heavy, rhythmic, endless. The Germans had the high ground. Every shot of theirs landed low, which meant it landed on you. The duckboards splintered. The trench walls collapsed. You dug new positions, only to have them fill with water in hours. You couldn't dry your socks, couldn't keep your rifle clean, couldn't find a single thing not soaked to the bone, including your bones. You caught trench foot. It started as numbness, then itching, then the skin peeled. The medic wrapped your foot in flannel and vinegar, told you to rotate socks every few hours. You didn't have dry socks to rotate. The rats thrived. Big ones, fat from the fallen. They grew bold, chewed into packs, dragged scraps into corners, stared at you with a predator's calm. Once, one bit your finger in your sleep. You punched it without thinking, then laughed. It was the first sound of joy in days. Harry didn't laugh much anymore. He kept coughing, wouldn't go to the medic. Said, "If I leave, I won't come back." You believed him. The objective was Passchendaele Ridge, a slope of dirt and concrete and barbed wire that used to be a village. By October, it was nothing but broken wood and bone fragments. You attacked it 4 times. Each time, you gained yards, feet, inches. Each time, you lost men, scores of them. By the 5th push, you stopped asking names. You focused on movement. 1 foot, then another. Rifle up, eyes forward. On one of those advances, you slipped, fell face first into a crater, landed on something soft. When you turned, it was a body, German, long gone, skin like wax, still holding a bayonet. You vomited in the mud beside him, then crawled out, wiped your mouth, and kept going. What else could you do? You wrote to Eleanor less during those months. Not for lack of trying. Just, what could you say? The rain hasn't stopped. I haven't seen Harry smile in weeks. I can't feel my toes. You didn't want to send that. So instead, you wrote, "It's difficult, but I think of home often. Your scarf has kept its scent. It's more comforting than I can say." She replied, "I've sent more wool. It's not much, but it's from my hands. That counts for something." And it did. You wore that new scarf under your coat, close to your chest, like armor. In November, they said Passchendaele was taken. You looked around and wondered what they'd taken. The ground was cratered beyond recognition. No trees, no walls, just twisted metal and half-buried men. But the ridge was ours. You nodded, saluted, ate cold rations, slept in your boots. The war moved on, and you somehow did too. At Passchendaele, you fought not just the enemy, but the rain, the mud, the rot, and the weight of everything that hadn't killed you yet. You became part of the land, sinking, surviving, remembering, and in the end, you emerged. Quieter, but still here. It's March 1918. You thought the worst had passed. Then came the spring offensive. You had learned to live in stillness. You'd survived the Somme, endured the mud of Passchendaele. You'd grown used to the war's slow rhythm, its rituals, its silence. A war of waiting, of attrition. You thought you understood it. But in March 1918, the war changed. It moved again, and it came running. The first clue wasn't a gunshot or a shell. It was a letter, intercepted from a German scout, translated, passed down by officers with pale faces. It spoke of Kaiserschlacht, the Kaiser's battle, a final push, a storm. You didn't believe it. Not really. Then the sky fell. On the 21st of March, before dawn, the artillery began. Not in waves, not in warning, but in drowning. It didn't sound like the shelling you knew. It sounded like the end of the world. Gas, high explosive, shrapnel, over 6,000 guns, all firing at once. You couldn't hear your own voice over it. You couldn't feel your fingers. You couldn't think. Harry was next to you, covering his ears, shouting something. You couldn't make it out. You just saw the panic in his eyes. Then came the fog, a strange, ghostly gray that drifted across no man's land and curled through the trenches like fingers. And out of it, they came. The Germans, by the thousands. Not trudging like before, not stiff ranks or slow waves, but running. Small units, stormtroopers, they called them. Fast, ruthless, masked by fog and chaos. They poured through gaps like water. You'd never seen anything like it. The officers screamed for resistance, but there was no line, no defense, only scattered fire, sudden flashes, men scrambling from dugouts half-dressed, half-armed. You fired until your rifle jammed, then you grabbed a shovel, then you ran. You ran with Harry, with dozens of others, back through trenches now too broken to hold, over boards you'd laid months ago, past crates and corpses and broken fences. You passed a captain kneeling by the side of the trench, his map soaked in mud, staring like he'd forgotten what a map even meant. You passed a chaplain trying to pull a wounded man from the muck, crying out prayers that no one could hear. You passed men who weren't moving at all. You ran. And the worst part wasn't the fear. It was the familiarity. You had retreated once before, back in 1914, when you were green and still full of questions. And now, years later, with half your heart gone and most of your soul numbed, you were doing it again, running from a war that refused to stay where you left it. But this time, you were slower. Not from injury, from weight. The weight of everything behind you. Everyone lost. Every letter unanswered. every name carved on crosses now buried by mud. You reached a fallback trench 2 miles east, only to find it already packed with wide-eyed boys, reinforcements, recruits, from London mostly, fresh uniforms, clean boots. One of them asked you if the stories were true. Did they really break the whole front? You looked at him, and for a moment saw yourself, years ago, before Ypres, before the Somme, before you'd started counting the days by who didn't come back. You said only, "Keep your head down." He nodded like it was wisdom, but you knew it wasn't enough. That night, the orders were clear. Hold this line at all costs. You didn't sleep. None of you did. You sat in the cold, cradling your rifle, staring into darkness, waiting for the fog to rise again. Eleanor's latest letter sat in your coat pocket. You hadn't opened it yet. Somehow, it felt cruel to read soft words in a place where nothing soft remained. But just before dawn, you did. She'd written, "Spring has come early in Norwich. I saw the crocuses blooming in the churchyard. It made me think of you. Strange how flowers can survive anything, isn't it?" You folded the letter gently, and you wept, just for a moment. Then the guns returned, and so did the enemy. And you stood, not because you believed in the line, not because of orders, not because of victory, but because someone out there believed in you. And that had to be enough. The war had risen again, not as thunder, but as a tide. And you, weary but still breathing, stood in its path once more, not to hold the world, but to remind it that you were still there. It's August 1918. You advanced through fields of ruin with no celebration, just the quiet march of men who had outlived their war. You didn't notice it at first. The change. After 4 years of stalemate, of standing still, of watching the front shift by inches, you were moving again. But no one cheered. There were no songs, no whistles, just quiet steps through broken villages and blackened woods where even the trees leaned like they'd grown tired of standing. It was August when the orders came. Advance. Not retreat, not dig in, not hold the line. Advance. You stared at the map, stained with tea and soot, and traced the line forward. Past Albert, past Cambrai, past the places you'd fought for and lost before. It didn't feel real. And yet, there you were, marching toward the horizon. The Germans were falling back, exhausted, undermanned, weakened by blockade and disease and the simple cruelty of time. But they still fought, desperate, sharp. Their machine guns didn't fire any slower. Their shells didn't miss more often. The difference now was that you kept coming, and you weren't alone. American divisions had joined the front. Australians, Canadians, French troops, hardened by revolt, returned to fight again. The tide had turned, not in a roar, but a grind. Relentless, weight behind every footfall. You moved in bursts. Push forward, dig in, hold, push again. Every mile cost something. A friend, a tooth, a piece of sleep you'd never get back. In early September, you found yourself in a small French town half flattened by artillery. You took shelter in a house with no roof, its piano somehow untouched in the corner. Harry sat on the bench, ran a finger along the keys. "Still in tune," he whispered. Then he played a chord. And in that open room, with no ceiling, no walls, just ruins and wind, it rang out like church bells. For a moment, the men outside froze, listening. You closed your eyes. You could almost imagine it was over. By October, the Germans were retreating faster. Some surrendered. Some abandoned posts. You passed trenches now empty, boots still neatly stacked, soup still warm. You began to see things that didn't fit. Villagers returning. Children watching from broken barns. A man herding sheep down a road lined with shell holes. Life, somehow, creeping back into a world still coughing up death. You kept Eleanor's letters folded in your left breast pocket, one for each month since Ypres. She wrote less poetry now, more simple things. The pears are ripening early this year. The train came late again. The conductor says the line is full of soldiers heading home. I think we might win, Thomas, but I don't know what winning looks like anymore. Neither did you. One day in late October, you passed a field covered in poppies, real ones. Not paper or pins, but actual blossoms, somehow grown through shrapnel and soot, bright red in the morning light. You didn't speak. You just stared. The last offensive came in November. You'd reached the outskirts of a village called Le Quesnoy, a fortified town surrounded by ancient walls. The Germans held firm. The attack was risky. The officers debated for hours. In the end, a group of New Zealanders scaled the walls with ladders. It was mad, brilliant, brave. You watched them rise into the mist like shadows. And when the last German rifle fell silent, you entered the town. No resistance. The church still stood. Bells silent. Shops looted long ago. You sat by the fountain. Harry beside you. He was coughing again. Harder now. Each breath shallow. You gave him your scarf. The one Eleanor sent you in 17. He didn't protest. He just held it like something sacred. And then, on the 7th of November, the whispers began. They're talking about surrender. Germany's collapsing. It might end. Soon. You didn't believe it. You couldn't. Not until the morning of the 11th. At dawn, a runner arrived. A single sheet of paper. Ink still drying. Hostilities will cease at the 11th hour. It was official. The guns would fall silent. But only at 11 a.m. You checked your watch. 9:45. Still over an hour to go. You looked at Harry. He just nodded. There was still time to die. So you went out one last time. To the line. To the mud. To the place you'd become a part of. And at 10:59 a.m., you were crouched behind a shattered wall, fingers on your rifle, when the last shell landed. It was close, but not yours. You flinched. Then, silence. True silence. Not waiting, not gasping, not a pause before the next volley. Just nothing. You looked up. Birdsong. Actual birds. You lowered your rifle. Harry limped toward you, sat down beside you, said nothing. You didn't speak either. What could you say? You'd survived, and you didn't know how to feel. You had moved through fire, fog, wire, ice, gas, and grief. And now, at last, you stood on ground no longer claimed by war. But peace. Peace would take longer to understand. And home was still ahead, was still. Today is November 11th, 1918. The guns stopped, but your heart kept marching. You didn't expect to wake up that morning. Not because of fear, not from some premonition, but because something in you had already begun to shut down. After everything, your body had learned to keep moving, even when your mind stayed behind. But you did wake. At 5:42 a.m., to be exact. Harry shook your shoulder gently. You opened your eyes, blinking up at the dim gray light filtering through a torn canvas above. He didn't speak, just handed you a folded note. You read it slowly, lips barely moving. The armistice has been signed. All hostilities to cease at 11 o'clock. You stared at it, then at him, then folded it again, slower than necessary. It didn't feel real, because how could something this enormous, this brutal, this forever, just stop? The gunfire still echoed in the hills. The trenches still stank of decay. The sky still wore the same dull frown it had for 4 years. Harry poured tea. You drank in silence. Then you cleaned your rifle, like every other morning, not out of habit, but out of something stranger. What if it wasn't true? What if someone didn't get the message? What if the war, like everything else in your life, had one last trick to play? At 6:30, new orders arrived. Hold your post, maintain the line, continue standard engagement protocol until the 11th hour. You nearly laughed. You thought of all the men who would die today, on the very last day, on the last morning. And you thought, how cruel must a war be to have a final hour of scheduled dying. At 8:17 a.m., a shell landed near your position. It shattered the wall above your dugout, sent dirt raining down like confetti. 3 men died. One of them was just 17. His name was Peter. You helped carry him to the side trench, eyes stinging. His boots were untied. His locket had fallen into the mud. You picked it up. Inside was a girl's face. You never found out who she was. At 9:40, the officers gathered. No speeches, no handshakes, just checked watches, adjusted coats, and waited. By 10:55, the fire had nearly stopped. Not fully, but the rhythm had changed. Like even the guns were tired, their fury replaced by something thin, skeletal, a wheeze instead of a roar. You stood with Harry behind a shattered wall. Neither of you spoke. You didn't need to. Your hands were on your rifles, not because you wanted to use them, but because that's what you were now. Men who held rifles, men who watched the clock. At 10:59 and 45 seconds, you closed your eyes. You didn't pray. Not exactly. You just breathed. Then came 11 o'clock, and everything stopped. Not in a flash, not in a cheer, in absence, a hollow, as if the sky had forgotten how to echo, as if time itself drew a curtain over the noise. Birds didn't sing, men didn't cheer, you didn't weep. You just listened. And what you heard was this: nothing. The kind of nothing that felt louder than the shell fire. A nothing filled with all the things left unsaid, all the names never spoken again, all the breaths that ended mid-sentence. It was over. But you didn't feel joy. You felt weight. You carried it like your kit, heavy, damp, unshakable. At noon, you walked the line, saw men sitting in silence, others sleeping, some praying. You passed a German prisoner, young, gaunt, with a torn sleeve. He nodded to you. You nodded back. No words. What could be said? You sat with Harry in the sun, the first real sun in days. He offered you half a cigarette. You lit it and passed it back. He smiled. Feels like we ought to feel something, doesn't it? You nodded. But I just feel tired. You leaned against the wall, the stones warm, and you looked out over the battlefield. For the first time, you didn't see a target. You saw a field, a place where things might grow again, where quiet might live, where memory might settle like dust, and maybe, just maybe, turn to seed. On the last day, you did not raise a flag. You did not shout. You simply stood and breathed and remembered. Because sometimes survival is the loudest victory. It's 1919. You returned home, but the world you remembered was no longer waiting in the same shape. You stepped off the train with your pack slung over one shoulder and silence in your bones. There was no parade, no band, just a breeze in the hedgerows and the distant creak of cartwheels in the village you hadn't seen in 5 years. Sussex. It looked the same, and it didn't. The forge was still there, your father's workshop. The gate still creaked the same way, but the colors felt different, softer, or maybe just quieter, as though time had faded the edges of the world while you were away. You walked the path to your mother's door with boots too large and a soul too small for all the memories packed inside it. She opened it before you knocked. She didn't speak, just reached up, cupped your face with both hands, rougher than you remembered, and held you there, not hugging, just checking, as if to say, "Is it really you? Are you still whole?" You didn't cry. Neither did she. The tears had long since dried somewhere back in Ypres, or the Somme, or in that dugout in Belgium where Harry had finally laid down his rifle and never picked it back up. You stayed in your old room that night. It smelled of dust and paper and something else. Childhood. You traced your fingers across the dresser, still marked with little carvings you'd made with a nail as a boy. There was a knock on the door around dusk. Your sister. She'd changed, but not too much. Still wore her hair tied back with ribbon. Still had that determined little smile, the one that meant she was holding back 100 questions. She didn't ask any of them. She just sat beside you on the edge of the bed and passed you a letter. The envelope was pale, familiar. You opened it slowly. Eleanor. She hadn't forgotten. The letter was dated just weeks before the armistice. Her words trembled across the page. I don't know if this will reach you. I don't know if you're still somewhere listening. But if you are, If you're still there, I wanted you to know that I kept the scarf, and I kept your poem, and I hope you return, not just to England, but to yourself. You read it 3 times before folding it neatly, placing it back into the envelope, and pressing it to your chest. She was still in Norwich. You made plans to write the next morning. The days passed slowly after that. You helped in the forge, walked the dog your sister had rescued during the war, visited the market, sat on benches, smelled rain in the grass. But peace had its own kind of weight, because while the war had taken your friends, your sleep, your silence, it had also given you purpose. And now, you were simply here, among people who hadn't seen what you saw, who didn't know how rats move through dead men's pockets, who didn't flinch at the sound of thunder, who didn't wake up gripping the edge of the mattress like it was a rifle. And they were kind, but they didn't understand. Sometimes you sat alone in the orchard behind the house, Eleanor's letters in your lap, listening to the birds and wondering if Harry would have liked this view. One evening, you received a package. No note, just a box. Inside, a small tin of pear preserves and a hand-stitched bookmark. Green thread, yellow edging. It smelled faintly of lavender. You closed your eyes, held it, let yourself drift. That night, you wrote Eleanor again. I don't yet know who I am in this new world, but I'd like to find out. With you. Weeks later, a reply came. Just one line. Come walk with me through something ordinary. And so you did. You traveled north in spring, wore a new coat, trimmed your beard, carried nothing but a notebook and a small leather-bound copy of Keats you'd kept in your kit since the Somme. She met you at the station, smiled before she even saw you properly. You recognized her, not from her face, from her voice, the softness of it, the strength, like letters spoken into life. You took her hand. It was warmer than you expected, and lighter than anything you'd carried in years. You had marched through fire, gas, silence, and sorrow. You had learned what it meant to survive the unthinkable. And now, on a quiet path through a field full of wild flowers, you began, at last, to remember how to live. The end, but perhaps in some way, the beginning too.